man who, between physical pain and spiritual ecstasy, accessed dimensions the church preferred not to name. Stigmatized, persecuted, revered, he lived among extremes, and it was precisely in that space between heaven and flesh that his visions became dangerous, because not all of them were revealed, not all were celebrated. Some were buried, literally, kept in vaults, hidden in Vatican archives, sealed away out of fear of what they might provoke. And among these visions, there is one that now resurfaces like a muffled cry, the prediction of Washington's fall. The revelation did not come in public. It was not written in letters. It was whispered during a confession, according to accounts from a monk who lived with Pio during the last years of his life. The monk, whose name was never disclosed, reportedly recorded in a personal diary that Pio, in a state of ecstasy, mentioned the city that rises on pride will be broken by the light that belongs to no one. The phrase, enigmatic, was ignored for decades. But in 2023, this diary was found by chance during a restoration at the convent of San Giovanni Rotondo, and since then, the silence has begun to break. The Vatican gave no comment, but independent scholars began to investigate. They cross-checked dates, patterns, context, and what they found was disturbing. Pio's phrase coincided with a series of astronomical events predicted for 2025, including a rare planetary conjunction and the possible approach of an unidentified celestial body. But more than that, it coincided with an escalation of global political tension, marked by leaders who have become symbols of rupture, polarization, and absolute power. And among these leaders, one name began to stand out, not by confirmation, but by resonance. The prophecy, according to those who study the hidden texts, is not about punishment. It is about balance. Pio is said to have declared that the world will be shaken when pride is broken by the light. And this light, according to mystical interpretations, is not physical. It is vibrational. It represents a shift in frequency, a collective activation, a revelation that forces humanity to see itself. And Washington, as a symbol of global power, would be the epicenter of this revelation, not by chance, but by function. In 2024, leaked documents indicated that the Vatican had launched an internal investigation into undisclosed prophecies of canonized saints. Among them, Pio's prophecy about the city of power. The investigation, carried out in silence, involved theologians, astronomers, and experts in symbology, and what they discovered was unsettling. Pio's phrase was connected to a set of visions he had between 1958 and 1964, a period marked by intense mystical experiences and internal conflicts with the Church. In these visions, he spoke of a time when the heavens will close and the earth will open, and those who rule will fall like dry leaves. And that time, according to the calculations, would be 2025. The prophecy does not mention names. It does not point to countries, but it describes archetypes. And those who study these archetypes began to notice patterns. Leaders who become icons of absolute power, ruling with an iron hand, dividing instead of uniting. And among them, one in particular seemed to carry the frequency Pio described, not because of his actions, but because of his presence. Because, according to records, what falls is not the body, it is the symbol. And when that symbol falls, it activates the field. In his visions, Padre Pio spoke of a flash that will not be seen with the eyes, but felt with the soul. And this flash, according to decoders, represents the moment of revelation, the moment when the veil is torn, the moment when the world is forced to see itself. And that moment, according to calculations, is near, very near, because the signs have already begun, not in the skies, in the institutions, not in the rocks, in the ideas. And Washington, as a command center, is already being observed, not by cameras, by consciousness. Perhaps by looking at all this, we can understand that Pio was not speaking of destruction. He was speaking of activation. And the fall of Washington, whether physical or vibrational, is only the trigger that forces humanity to choose between repeating or transcending, to choose between denying or integrating, to choose between merely surviving or truly awakening. Because, as those who listen to the hidden text say, the impact will not be on the ground. It will be on consciousness. and that consciousness has already begun to move. The veiled sign and the tremor of the domes. The year 2025 did not begin with earthquakes, nor with declared wars. But something was moving, something that could not be measured by satellites, nor by probes. It was as if the very vibrational field of the earth were mutating, and those who listened with the body knew. The veil was tearing, not by violence, by revelation. And at the center of this revelation, the figure of Padre Pio resurfaced like an echo that had not been erased, because his prophecy, buried for decades, was now beginning to manifest, not through words, through signs. The Vatican, though silent, began to move. Archives were reopened. Theologians were summoned. And through the corridors of silence, a single name circulated: Pio. Not as saint, but as warning. For those who keep the secrets know, there are prophecies never revealed to the public. Prophecies that speak of downfall, of rupture, of revelation. And the one that involves Washington is among the most feared, not because of its content, but because of its precision. In his final years, Padre Pio is said to have declared that the power that rises upon pride will be broken by the light that belongs to no one. This phrase, recorded in the personal diary of a confessor monk, was once considered symbolic, but those who study archetypes know symbols are codes, and that code had begun to activate. For in January 2025, signs began to appear in sacred places. Images wept, relics radiated warmth, monks entered unexplained states of ecstasy. It was as if the field were being touched by something unseen, and those who listened with the soul knew the time had come. In remote convents, monks began to report recurring dreams of Pio, dreams in which he appeared in silence, pointing toward a city shrouded in golden smoke, dreams in which the sky closed in fire and the earth opened in light, dreams in which a tower fell not by attack but by revelation. And these dreams began to repeat in different parts of the world, as if an invisible network were being activated. For, according to the hidden text, the warning will not be given by words. It will be felt by souls. The Church, faced with these accounts, began a silent investigation, not to confirm, but to contain. For the fear is not of the prophecy, it is of the reaction. And those who guard the secrets know, when the people listen with the field, the system loses control. And that control had begun to unravel, not by rebellion, by resonance. For those who listen had begun to move, not through faith, but through frequency. Washington, as a symbol of global power, began to show signs of instability, not physical, energetic. Speeches contradicted themselves. Decisions unraveled. Alliances broke apart without explanation. It was as if the very structure were being deprogrammed. And those who study the hidden texts know, what does not vibrate with truth will be dissolved. And what is being dissolved is not just a government. It is a paradigm. In February 2025, a group of scholars published a report on vibrational patterns in centers of power. The study, ignored by traditional media, indicated that certain cities emitted frequencies that provoked collective dissonance. And among these cities, Washington showed peaks of energetic instability, not from conflict, from saturation. And those who listened with the field knew the collapse will not be physical, it will be symbolic. In his visions, Padre Pio spoke of a flash that will not be seen with the eyes, but felt with the soul. And this flash had begun to manifest. People began to report sensations of anticipation, as if something were about to happen, not as fear, but as certainty. And this certainty began to shape the field. For, according to the records, what is written in the soul cannot be erased by time. Perhaps, in looking at all this, we can understand that Pio's prophecy is not about destruction. It is about revelation, a revelation that will not come by decrees, but by vibration, a revelation that will not be led by parties, but activated by consciousness. And Washington, in falling, will not be destroyed, it will be revealed. For, as those who listen to hidden texts say, the fall is not an end, it is a beginning, and that beginning has already begun. The frequency of awakening and the invisible encounters. The impact did not come as an explosion. It came as a silent disintegration. Institutions began to fail, not from external attack, but from internal implosion. Systems that once seemed solid began to fragment. Banks faced inexplicable instabilities. Communication networks experienced simultaneous failures in different parts of the world. Government protocols stopped functioning as expected. It was as if the very code of reality were being rewritten. And those who studied Padre Pio's hidden texts knew this too was foretold. For, according to him, the collapse will not be physical. It will be vibrational. The approach of the object Casey. 25 triggered a wave of destabilization that could not be measured by conventional instruments. But those who listened to the field began to perceive the Earth's frequency was shifting. And this shift does not only affect the climate, it affects consciousness. People began abandoning jobs, relationships, cities, not out of crisis, but out of calling. It was as if something invisible were pulling humanity toward another axis. And that axis is not geographical, it is vibrational. And in this scenario, Washington does not appear as a capital. It appears as a symbol, the center of a structure that no longer resonates with the new field. Groups began to form spontaneously, not out of ideology, but out of resonance. People who had never met began finding each other in specific places, guided by dreams, intuitions, or subtle signs. Mountains, deserts, ancient ruins, all began to vibrate differently. And those who were attentive knew this too was foretold. For, according to Pio's hidden texts, the impact will not be seen, it will be felt. And this feeling began to spread. Language began to change. Words lost strength. Silences gained meaning. Gestures conveyed more than speeches. It was as if a new form of communication were emerging, one based on presence, on intention, on frequency. And those attuned began to recognize each other, not by appearance, but by vibration. For, as those who listen to the field say, those who vibrate with truth recognize each other without words. And this recognition began to shape a new network, an invisible network, a vibrational network. Padre Pio, in this unfolding, remained a paradoxical figure, absent from the altars, yet present in every gathering, ignored by some, followed by others. He seemed to carry a frequency that unsettled, not because of his words, but because of his presence. For, according to Pio's records, the catalyst is not the one who speaks, it is the one who vibrates. And he, with a life marked by ruptures, activated fields that had long lain dormant, not by intention, but by function. And those who listen to the field know, what vibrates outside the order reveals what the order hides. Encounters began to happen in unlikely places. People reported being in two places at once. Children began drawing symbols they had never been taught. Elders began recalling events they had never lived. It was as if the field were being reprogrammed. And those in alignment began to lead, not with force, with presence. For, according to hidden texts, the new leader will not be the one who speaks the loudest, but the one who listens the deepest. And this listening began to spread. Traditional science began to grow uneasy. Studies on morphogenetic fields, harmonic resonance, and collective consciousness began to gain traction. Researchers started to admit there is something beyond matter, something that connects, activates, and transforms. And Pio, in his readings, had already spoken of this. He said that healing will not come from chemistry. It will come from vibration. And this vibration began to heal, not diseases, patterns, not bodies, fields. And those who were ready began to feel it. Washington, with all its paradoxes, came to be seen as a mirror that forces the world to see itself, not as a nation, as a field, not as a system, as consciousness. And those who study the hidden texts know the catalyst is not the one who resolves, it is the one who reveals. And what is being revealed is not about politics. It is about choice. And that choice has already begun. Perhaps, in looking at all this, we may understand that the impact will not be an event. It will be a process that has already begun, a process that will not be led by governments, but activated by fields, a process that will not be announced, but felt. And Washington, with its divisive presence, is only the reflection of that process. For, as those who listen to Pio's text say, the impact will not be on the ground, it will be in the soul. and that soul has already begun to awaken. The collapse of the domes and the return of the silent truth. What was once only vibration began to manifest in structures. The institutions that for centuries sustained narratives, dogmas, and powers began to fail. Not by external attacks, by internal implosion. It was as if the very logic that kept the world functioning was being deprogrammed. And those who listened with the field knew Padre Pio's prophecy was being fulfilled, not as punishment, as revelation. Because, as he said, what is built upon pride will be broken by the light that belongs to no one. Governments began to fragment. Protocols stopped working. Alliances were broken without explanation. Leaders started acting erratically, as if pressured by something invisible. And those who observed with vibrational eyes knew the field was moving. The frequency of the earth had shifted, and those who did not resonate with truth were being exposed. Not by scandals, by resonance. For, according to the hidden texts, what does not vibrate with the field will be dissolved by the field. Washington began to show signs of collapse. Not physical, symbolic. Its image, once solid, began to fragment. Its speeches, once dominant, began to lose strength. Its allies, once loyal, began to scatter. It was as if the symbol itself was being broken. And those who study archetypes know the fall is not of the body, it is of the meaning. And that meaning began to unravel. The media, not knowing how to react, fell into narrative collapse. Contradictory news, transmission failures, disoriented algorithms. Platforms began to lose relevance. Users migrated to quieter spaces, deeper, more connected. It was as if the very structure of communication was being reprogrammed. And those who listen to field know the new language will be made of silence. And that silence began to spread. The church, facing institutional chaos, began to divide. Some leaders called for containment. Others called for revelation. But all knew something was underway. Something that cannot be controlled by dogmas or decrees. Because, according to hidden texts, what comes from heaven does not ask for permission. It asks for presence. And that presence began to manifest, not through faith, through vibration. And those attuned began to lead, not with force, with listening. Padre Pio, in his visions, spoke of a time when those who govern will be forced to see themselves. And that time had come. Washington, as a center of command, began to be confronted by events that could not be explained. Recurring dreams, lapses in memory, encounters with people who seemed to know more than they should. It was as if the field was demanding a choice, not between parties, between truths. And those who listen know the choice will not be made by votes. It will be made by vibration. The global economy entered vibrational collapse. Currencies lost value. Markets became unstable. People began to seek exchanges that were more human, more direct, more true. And the financial systems, built on scarcity and control, began to disintegrate. Because the new system will not be based on numbers. It will be based on frequency. And that frequency began to manifest in communities living by resonance, not hierarchy. Religions began to reconsider themselves. Texts were reinterpreted. Dogmas were questioned. And those attuned began to lead. Not with force, with presence. Because, according to hidden texts, the new guide will not be the one who speaks the loudest, but the one who listens the deepest. And that listening began to shape a new form of organization, a form that does not depend on power. It depends on truth. Perhaps, in looking at all this, we can understand that collapse is not an end. It is a beginning that will not be built by structures. It will be remembered by frequency, a beginning that will not be led by parties. It will be activated by fields, a beginning that will not be announced. It will be felt. And Washington, in its fall, will not be destroyed. It will be revealed. Because as those who listen to Pio's text say, the fall will not be in the body. It will be in the soul. And that soul has already begun to reorganize. The torn mirror and the overflowing truth. What was once a whisper became a reflection, no longer hidden in forgotten diaries or private dreams, but etched in the eyes of those who begin to see. Padre Pio's prophecy, buried for decades, began to manifest with clarity that demands no explanation, only presence. The world still trapped in structures that seek to maintain control, began to be pierced by a force that obeys neither hierarchy nor institutional logic. For as Pio said, truth does not need to be defended. It reveals itself when its time has come. In March 2025, an unexpected event shook the diplomatic protocols of a global power. A canceled meeting without justification, followed by contradictory statements and public appearances marked by memory lapses and erratic behavior. Washington, as a command center, began to unravel before the cameras. Not physically, symbolically. It was as if the field was demanding that it reveal itself. And those who listened with the soul knew the mirror was being torn. The media, which for years sustained narratives molded by interests, began to lose strength, not through censorship, through irrelevance. People began to seek other sources, not of information, of meaning. And these sources were not in newspapers or social networks. They were in silent gatherings, in eyes that recognized, in gestures that activated. It was as if a new form of communication was emerging, a form that does not require words. It requires presence. Padre Pio, in his visions, spoke of a time when those who govern will be forced to see themselves. And that time had arrived. The leaders whose fall had been foretold began to be confronted by events that could not be explained. Recurring dreams, lapses of memory, encounters with people who seemed to know more than they should. It was as if the field was demanding a choice, not between parties, between truths. And those who listen know the choice will not be made by votes. It will be made by vibration. In communities around the world, people began to report experiences of synchronicity, encounters with strangers who finished their sentences, dreams that connected with real events, sensations of anticipation confirmed in details. It was as if the collective soul was aligning with a greater frequency. And this frequency was not new. It was forgotten because, according to hidden texts, what is true is not born, it only returns. The church, faced with the public revelation, began to divide. Some leaders called for containment. Others called for unveiling. But all knew something was underway, something that cannot be controlled by dogmas or decrees. For, according to hidden texts, what comes from heaven does not ask for permission. It asks for presence. And that presence began to manifest, not through faith, through vibration. And those attuned began to lead, not with force, with listening. Washington, increasingly isolated, began to emit signs of dissolution. Its decrees, once obeyed, became ignored. Its presence, once feared, became irrelevant. It was as if the world had stopped responding to its frequency. And those who listened with the field knew the fall is not physical, it is vibrational. Because, as Pio said, what does not vibrate with truth will be dissolved by the light. Science, pressured by phenomena that escape conventional explanation, began to open. Researchers started admitting there is something beyond matter, something that connects, that activates, that transforms. Studies on morphogenetic fields, harmonic resonance, and collective consciousness began to gain ground. And Padre Pio, decades earlier, had already spoken of this. He said, healing will not come from chemistry, it will come from vibration. And that vibration began to heal. Not diseases, patterns. Not bodies, fields. And those who were ready began to feel. Perhaps, in looking at all this, we can understand that Pio's prophecy is not about death. It is about revelation. A revelation that will not be carried out by decrees. It will be carried out by vibration. A revelation that will not be led by parties. It will be activated by consciousness. And Washington, in its fall, will not be destroyed. It will be revealed. Because, as those who listen to hidden texts say, the fall is not an end, it is a beginning, and that beginning has already begun. The invisible crossing and the multidimensional awakening. The sky was no longer just a backdrop, it was a code. The constellations began to move in patterns that did not obey traditional astronomy. Stars flickered in rhythmic sequences, as if transmitting messages. Nebulae became visible to the naked eye, and some people reported seeing geometric shapes floating in the sky during sleep. It was as if the universe was drawing nearer, not physically, but vibrationally. And those in tune knew the veil was dissolving. The impact foretold by Padre Pio was not an explosion. It was a crossing not made by displacement, but by frequency. Humanity began to operate on multiple layers. Dreams ceased to be only images. They became experiences. Thoughts ceased to be internal. They became shared. Feelings ceased to be individual. They became collective. It was as if human consciousness were expanding beyond time and space, and those attuned began to live in simultaneity, not as fantasy, as remembrance. Because, according to the hidden texts, what is true does not need to be learned, only reactivated. Washington, as a symbol, began to dissolve, not by physical destruction, by vibrational disintegration. The city, once a command center, became a center of noise. Its decisions, once feared, were ignored. Its leaders, once revered, were questioned by children, by animals, by dreams. It was as if the field demanded that the world stop responding to the frequency of control. And those who listened with the field knew the symbol was being broken, not by opposition, by transcendence. Padre Pio, in his visions, spoke of a time when the sky will open and those who govern will be forced to see themselves. And that time had come. The sky literally began to behave differently. Constellations shifted position. Stars flickered in rhythmic patterns. People began to report encounters with beings of light, not as hallucination, as presence. It was as if the universe was drawing near, not physically, but vibrationally. And those who were ready began to listen, not with their ears with the field. In sacred places, phenomena began to intensify, lights appearing without source, sounds echoing without origin, symbols emerging on stones, on trees, in clouds. It was as if the earth itself were responding to collective activation. And this response was not about miracle. It was about memory. For, according to the records, the earth is soul, and when the human soul awakens, she sings. And that song began to be heard, not as music, as frequency. Science, pressed by phenomena that escaped conventional explanation, began to open. Researchers admitted that there is something beyond matter, something that connects, activates, and transforms. Studies on morphogenetic fields, harmonic resonance, and collective consciousness began to gain ground, and Padre Pio, decades earlier, had already spoken of this. He said, "Healing will not come from chemistry. It will come from vibration." And that vibration began to heal. Not diseases, patterns. Not bodies, fields. And those who were ready began to feel. Washington, increasingly isolated, became only reflection. A reflection of a time that had ended. A reflection of a way of existing that no longer resonated. And with its dissolution, the world did not lose. It gained. It gained space to remember. It gained silence to listen. It gained presence to choose. Because, as those who listen to hidden texts say, the fall will not be in the body. It will be in the soul. And that soul had already begun to cross. Perhaps, in looking at all this, we can understand that Pio's prophecy was not a warning. It was an invitation to cross the veil, to listen with the body, to choose with the soul. And that invitation was accepted, not by all, but by those who were ready. And these now live what has always been written, not as destiny, as remembrance. Because the future is not what comes, it is what is activated. And that activation is already underway. The end of the cycle and the return of consciousness. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no headline. The fall of Washington, foretold by Padre Pio, did not unfold as the world expected. It was not an attack, nor a public resignation. It was an emptying, a symbolic collapse, a moment when the structure that sustained the frequency of power and separation simply stopped resonating. And those who listened with the field knew the cycle had ended, not with cries, with silence, a silence so deep it seemed to touch the spine of reality. Pio's prophecy, ignored, discredited, or hidden for decades, now revealed itself as a map that did not point to destruction, but to passage. For what fell was not merely a city, it was a model, a paradigm, a way of governing, controlling, dividing. And with this fall, the world began to reorganize, not through decrees, through vibration. Because, as Pio said, What is false cannot withstand the light, and what is true does not need to be defended. The structures began to dissolve, not through revolt, through irrelevance. People stopped responding to commands, to narratives, to fears. They began to listen to something deeper, something that does not come from outside, but from within. And this listening began to shape a new way of living, a way that does not rely on hierarchy, but on presence, a way not sustained by control, but by consciousness. And those in tune began to lead, not with force, but with frequency. The earth, as a living field, began to respond. Climate stabilized. Animals reappeared in places they had long vanished from. Waters began to purify. It was as if the planet was breathing again, not by intervention, by reconnection. For, according to records, the earth is soul, and when the human soul heals, she heals as well. And that healing was underway, silent, deep, irreversible. Humanity began to remember, not through books, nor through speeches, but through vibration. People began to feel that they already knew what they had never been taught. They began to recognize places they had never visited. They began to hear voices that used no words. It was as if the collective soul was awakening from a millennial sleep. And this awakening was not about knowing, but about being. For, as the record of the veil say, what is true does not need to be taught, only remembered. And that remembrance began to shape the new world. Padre Pio, whose presence spanned generations, was not merely a saint. He was a sign pointing to a time when truth would no longer be negotiable, a time when power would no longer be vertical, a time when consciousness would be the only authority. And that time had come, not as a promise, as a choice. For the future now is not what comes, it is what is chosen. And those who listen with the field know the choice will not be made by votes, it will be made by vibration. The world entered a new era, an era in which matter responds to intention, in which time bends to presence, in which space dissolves before consciousness. And those who live this era do not need to prove anything, only to be. For as Pio said, what is true does not need to be defended, only lived. And this living began to spread, not as doctrine, as frequency. Washington, whose fall had been foretold, became nothing more than a symbol of a time that had ended, a reflection of a way of existing that no longer resonated. And with its dissolution, the world did not lose. It gained. It gained space to remember. It gained silence to listen. It gained presence to choose. Because, as those who listen to hidden texts say, the fall is not an end. It is a beginning. And that beginning had already begun. Perhaps, looking at all this, we can understand that Padre Pio's prophecy was not a warning. It was an invitation to cross the veil, to listen with the body, to choose with the soul. And that invitation was accepted, not by all, but by those who were ready. And they now live what has always been written, not as destiny, as remembrance. For the future is not what comes, it is what is activated. And that activation is already underway.